Hello, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. Matthew Coller here, and returning to the show, Kevin Cole, the Unexpected Points newsletter and podcast now, because Kevin and I have something in common. We both did nothing wrong and lost our jobs. So welcome to the independent universe, Kevin.
I'm happy to be here. I mean, can you say that you've done nothing wrong though? Like, I guess you could probably say you've done nothing wrong. I don't think I've done anything wrong, but at the same point in time, whenever there's a decision, even if it's not performance related, to let some people go and not let some other people go, you got to wonder. Yeah, you got to wonder a little bit about what's going on here. But we are moving forward. We're moving forward with the Substack, as you mentioned, a little bit different type of analysis that I'm doing that I enjoy doing a little bit more. So it's normally all for the best. I think everyone needs a little bit of a shakeup sometimes to produce their best work, and that's hopefully what I'm getting here.
Well, I can say, just from my own perspective, that it has worked out incredibly well for me. And one of the coolest parts is the support that I've gotten from Vikings fans. When you work in sports radio or for a company like PFF, you could feel a little bit like part of the team and a little separated. But the way that it is now, the number of people who have come in and supported this thing, gotten behind it, that I've gotten to know, like, kind of on a personal level, that I communicate with so much more than I did before. Like, there's a lot of rewarding things to it. Plus, I don't have to answer to anybody, which is also pretty great. So there are benefits, but I was very sad to see about PFF and the layoffs that they had to go through. And of course, you've been one of my favorite guests on the show. So yes, certainly not reflective of your work, which is why you're here to talk a little bit about the Unexpected Points newsletter, which is just going to be a lot of your work that you were doing there, only more focused toward things that people can read and less behind the scenes analytics stuff. But let's start off with just talking some Vikings, though. Here's my big question about the Vikings from a data analytics perspective, because I think that they have a very hard decision down the stretch: who to rest, how to handle week 18 against Chicago if the number 2 seed is on the line versus maybe losing that game and playing whoever and getting the number 3 seed. And I tried my best. Now, I'm no you when it comes to breaking stuff down analytically. I tried to research this to figure out how much is this supposed to matter. Of course, home teams win more in the divisional round than the road teams, because the road teams are usually worse. So they're usually not as good of teams. But when I looked up like the point spreads and things to give me a better idea, like, okay, so the Vikings won't be, 13-point underdogs or something if they go on the road. It'll be a little bit closer than that. The results were much closer to 50-50 for teams covering. That was the best way that I could think to do it. How can we figure this out, Kevin? Because I think on one side you could say, look, get that 2 seed. You need that second home game if you're going to get to the Super Bowl. But the other side of that is one person hits Justin Jefferson wrong, or Christian Darrisaw, or Zadarius Smith, and this team just teeters and collapses.
Yeah, so we're talking about, you mentioned week 18. I like to think about it maybe even in a broader sense of saying the next full 3 weeks. What do we want to think about happening? And teams have some experience in this, only really dealing with the preseason and how they want to use different players. But it's really going to come to weighing tradition in a way, which would be if there is any sort of possible benefit on the line through playing, then you play until that's not been done. I'm not sure in the regular season, beyond maybe some week 18 games where it could flip some home field advantage, whether we've seen anyone rest multiple weeks in advance. I think that's really what to look at here, because when we think about the benefit of resting, whatever that may be, and some people say it's a hindrance to rest, to you're rusty for the playoffs. I don't really believe any of that. We have lots of evidence through lots of time of teams being better off of their bye week than they would have been if they had played the week before. So I think we can, right, rest is good. Rest is good. Maybe too much rest of multiple weeks isn't great, but rest is good. But you also have to say, what are the scenarios that we're talking about here under which you can get a benefit? Because it is, number one, how things play out. If you rest players, it doesn't mean necessarily that you're not going to secure the number 2 seed. So you have to figure, like, what is the number 2 seed versus not getting the number 2 seed? Number two, what is the likelihood of getting of it really affecting us going into the next round of the playoffs, right? So it's not even the first week. We're talking about the second week of the playoffs that'll really have an effect as far as not being at home. And third, I think maybe even most importantly, is looking at what sort of home field advantage, what is it worth, and where will you potentially be playing? And it looks like, if you're going to lose out on that, it's maybe most likely to San Francisco at this point. The Cowboys are a possibility. We're talking about two teams in good weather and then similar sort of environment there. And you're playing in a dome at home. So I'm not sure, at least from a weather perspective, it makes that big of a deal also. So all those things lean towards me as maybe trying something a little bit new and at the very least platooning some different guys who you might want to get rest and keep away from injuries.
And Kevin O'Connell talked about this yesterday. I asked him specifically, like, how will you manage this since you're already in the playoffs? And he alluded to what you're saying with platooning, where he said, like, of course, we have things that we still want to accomplish. And of course, we see that top seed or the number 2 seed. And number 1 is almost out of reach at this point. But number 2 is really up for debate. When you look at the fact that San Francisco right now has the tiebreaker against them. So you can't even tie San Francisco's record, which would be losing one game. And the 49ers, they play Washington, Arizona's one of their games, and there's another one mixed in that they're all very winnable, though, all 3 games for them. So they could end up 13-4, even with Brock Purdy as their quarterback. I think it is pretty scary to go out to San Francisco, but the thing that I've noticed in recent years is that the home field advantage is not the same as it was before. So I looked up even just this year's point differential for the Vikings home and on the road. It's kind of negligible. It's not that different. Most of their wins have been by 1 score because they're always by 1 score, both home and on the road. They lost to Detroit in a game where, I think that if the defense makes a single stop or if they don't fumble, you're playing, pretty close with them. And I just don't see the same impact even on opposing teams as even when I first started covering the Vikings. In 2016, I think teams were totally shocked to see what it was like inside US Bank Stadium, but it's been around a while. Teams travel much better. The health and science has even changed in the last 5 to 7 years. And I think that Vegas has sort of picked up on this where it used to be 3 points, and now they only give maybe like 1.5 points for going on the road. Now, that doesn't make Vikings fans feel better about it when I say you have to go out to San Francisco, and that's been a house of horrors for them in recent years. But I also think that having a fully healthy roster is so important to this team specifically. Like we can look at the broader sense, but we can also look at if you drop from Christian Darrisaw down to Oli Udoh, you go from the best tackle in the league to a guy who graded out to be a 40 by PFF last year playing at guard and tackle. Like that's a massive, massive difference. And that's somebody who's had a couple of injuries this year. Zadarius Smith, Danielle Hunter, these guys make up literally half of your total pressures for the team. I added them up, half, but 2 guys. If you lose one of them, it's over. You're not pressuring any quarterbacks ever. So I think that there really is a tough balance here that they can do some of that rotating, play half the game for some of those guys in the next 2 weeks and see what happens. And then I lean towards sitting the starters, but I think that, like you said, the football men, also the owners might say, look, I want that second home playoff game if you guys win. So I think that they're in a very difficult position here with this, like good problem to have, but not the easiest choice.
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get more information as we go along, too, based upon the potential for the 49ers to lose, let's say, next week. It looks like the other remaining game was the Raiders. I don't think that you had mentioned of those two. So, yeah, another game, which there's a lot of teams that are just kind of like average-ish. So, the Raiders are another one of those teams where you never know what could happen in these circumstances. So you're going to want to gain more and more information each week that goes by. So I like platooning. You're right about home field advantage. It had actually almost reversed in some recent years. It's still settling in probably around 1.5 points. So if you say being in one place versus another, you could say 3 points. But in some ways, that's even overstated because when you're like between like point spreads, when they're between like a 3-point advantage, there are very few games that really fall into that category. So we're talking about 2 to 3 points maybe, which makes a difference, but it's not fundamentally driving everything. I do agree, though, when it comes to San Francisco, you cannot help but have the 2019 San Francisco home run home field debacle for the Vikings there. And then, they went and just, kicked the stuff out of the Packers the next week, also at home. That's evidence. That's something you want to think about. It's probably also something that you're going to overweight versus others. I mean, you don't see the San Francisco 49ers always turn into the Incredible Hulk at home on a week-on-week basis. So you're going to think about that, and the fans are definitely going to think about that, though, when it comes to their decision if they end up giving up that number 2 seed eventually.
And they might say, too, that, look, it's a rookie quarterback starting, and it's going to be harder for a rookie quarterback to play at US Bank Stadium than it would be Jimmy Garoppolo, who's got tons of experience going on the road to wherever over the years. But yeah, this is the thing. Like I've gotten quite a few messages and emails from fans and stuff about this. And like, I don't know. Like I really don't know.
I think
what
you
the
play
right
it pretty
answer
safe
is.
this week. Play it pretty safe this week. You'll learn a lot. It could reshuffle all thoughts, going into what the situation is next week. So that's what I would say. I'm fine with playing it pretty close to normal, maybe some rest, lean towards sitting guys who may have played if you really needed a win type of situation where we're talking about guys who are questionable or on the doubtful side of questionable, and then reassess a week from now. We get a little bit more information. We can make a lot better decision at that point.
And you also know that either way, fans are going to be very afraid, because if they end up with the 3 seed, they're going to say, uh-oh, here we go. Like, we're going out to San Francisco to lose, marching to our death. Or they're going to say, oh, no, we're playing starters at Chicago. Talk about House of Horrors for the Vikings and who's getting hurt in this very important game. So I'm still leaning slightly toward.
You mean there's not going to be like
starters.
a very analytical, rational, hey, we're not that good and we're playing with house money anyway this season. That's how I would view it. But then again, I have no loyalty and no fandom.
Well, that's a good transition, though, because something that has been tricky for me in terms of talking about this team all season long is how much I have always leaned on a lot of the numbers to be my beacon of truth. And this year has gone against pretty much anything that any numbers could ever tell you, right? Like the 10-0 in one score games and all the stuff that's gone into this. Your Football Outsiders DVOA has just hated the Vikings all year long and said, no, this team can't keep doing this. And yet somehow they have found a way to keep doing this. And I think that there is certainly an argument to look at the accumulation of a team and go, I don't know, man, there's teams with 130 point differentials that should be way stronger than you. But then there's another part that says this team has a lot of star talent and always seems to find a way. How do you deal with these competing ideas, the reality of their record, and you are what your record says you are, versus some of the under the radar numbers?
Yeah, I mean, I try to keep my radar scope, I guess, as wide as possible on some of these things. And if under the radar is like a euphemism for doesn't really matter sort of thing, then yeah, maybe I'm going to discount some of the things about, I mean, star power is important, definitely more important in the playoffs. It's probably less of a thing in the NFL than it is in the NBA, where rotations and referees and others make a big difference between the playoffs and not. But it is a thing, and I think experience can definitely be a thing in the playoffs. Okay, so just so you know, I have the Vikings in my most recent power ratings, which you can check out on unexpectedpoints.substack.com, at, let me see here, 17th in the power rankings. So right in the middle of the league. But I'll say that the difference between 10th and, again, like, there aren't 10 good teams. So stop yelling at me for whoever I have in 10th place. So I have the Bucks in 10th place, who actually moved up a little bit despite the loss there. So the difference between 10th and 23rd, which are the New York Giants, is basically like a point and a half or something. It's barely anything. So there's not much of a difference here. So I don't think the Vikings are in the same company when we're talking about the first or second tier, which includes Dallas, Miami, San Francisco, Cincinnati, Buffalo, Eagles, and Kansas City. I don't think they're in that tier. But after that, it's all open for anyone can win it here. And we're in a situation where I think for the NFC, you have the Bucks who could win a home game. I'm assuming they're going to it, or if it's the Saints, they could win a home game, and then they're like in the general mix also for someone you could potentially play in the second round. So there are lots of easy paths for them. So I think they're in as good of a position as you could really hope for at this point. And I wouldn't play too much into the fact that they're kind of an average-ish sort of team. I think that's fine. Average teams have won plenty of Super Bowls in the history of the NFL.
Well, and that's why I feel like, I mean, just circling back, like the health is a huge part of it. But then there's another thing with the matchups. And I mean, just even last year, having 2 4 seeds go to the Super Bowl. And as I was writing about this, looking at, previous teams and their paths, it was like, oh, okay, just last year, both teams had to go on the road in the divisional round and they ended up winning. And, the Rams had that crazy game against the Tampa Bay Bucks. But I'd love to know kind of like how the sauce is made a little bit there when you're trying to figure out the power rankings, which here's where I'm going to give you credit, because I can hear people's brains burning with, what do you mean they're wherever? Power rankings are usually, when they're just done off the top of people's heads, just the standings. And that is not how you do it. You're doing it in a mathematical type of way, but what factors into that points to why they wouldn't be, despite their record, in the same category as someone like Philadelphia or Dallas?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, without getting into like too many of the details here, I'm looking at efficiency more than what the actual scoring is. So efficiency, and this is mostly based upon using the preferred metric of nerds out there, expected points added per play, which is really a calculation of how many points you expect before a play happens on a drive. Then the play happens, you have a new down distance in yards to goal situation. You can calculate the expected points there, and then you add the difference. It's a better way than yards or anything else of gauging the value of any play. Now, I make a bunch of adjustments to this based upon down weighting some kind of unexpected outlier type of outcomes. For instance, looking at the massive negatives that came for the Bucks, as I mentioned, when they had 4 turnovers by a Brady offense. I think it was the first time since in the last 10 years that that's happened. It's probably not going to happen a whole lot, where they actually look pretty good in the first half. So it's like that sustainable sort of offensive success is more important to me when valuing results than the massive negatives that come to scoring and come to EPA through these outlier plays. Special teams are going to be discounted a bit of what's going on. Penalties are going to be discounted a little bit. So there's some other adjustments to the formula. So I try to come up with a more sustainable number for offensive and defensive, what you can expect from this team, how they have played, and then use that to project out into the future, which of course, you're not necessarily going to be the same thing in the future, but we are 15 weeks, 16 weeks into the NFL season. So from that, I mean, maybe I'm going already too far here. It's about a 60-40 weighting between offense and defense, because defense is more dependent upon what's happened, the offense you're playing, than the offense is upon the defense. And then from there, it's getting a number, strength of schedule adjustments, all that sort of stuff based upon who you've played. And then that is going to project forward for the strength of the team. And that's why for the Vikings, if you look at their offensive efficiency, kind of scoring rate, and their defensive scoring against rate, they are very similar this season to the Seahawks, the Giants, the Jaguars, the Steelers, even the Chargers are all almost in the same exact category. They're almost on top of each other if you were to plot these things out against them. And that's why I see them as being in the larger mix of these average teams. Whereas if you plot out, in particular, defensively, the Vikings defense has not been very good this year. If you plot out a lot of these other teams, their defense has been really good. And then when it comes to Kansas City, their defense has been slightly better, but their offense has been at another level as far as their efficiency they've been able to generate.
Yeah, so the Vikings, just from Pro Football Reference, are 18th in the percentage of drives that they score, and have the second worst in terms of the percentage of drives of which they allow points. And a lot of times in the last few weeks against the Jets and then against the Colts, they've relied really heavily on red zone stops against really bad quarterbacks. I mean, Mike White is a nice story for Jets fans, but it's Mike White. He was their third choice. And then Matt Ryan is just, I wish they had not played him anymore after the way that the start of the season went, because it's just so sad to see. Like, I've seen that guy do great things against the Vikings over the years, And, he was a great quarterback, but he certainly is not anymore. So it's not surprising that they would get those red zone stops. But if they're facing a San Francisco that has Deebo Samuel, Brandon Ayuk, Christian McCaffrey, George Kittle, and Trent Williams, it's going to be pretty tough to stop them over and over at the goal line like they've been able to do with some of these other teams. So I think that the skepticism, of course, Vikings fans are riding a high from what just happened, the largest comeback of all time. So nobody wants to say like, hey, is it what what's all this, these other things that say we're not that strong. But, we kind of circle back to after Detroit, where they talked about, kind of panicking and pushing the red button when it came to their defense. They made some adjustments against the Colts. Who knows if those will work against other teams? I don't really know. I did want to ask, like, how much it matters going into the playoffs, what a team has looked like recently, because when we take these stats, they're all the accumulation of the whole season, but I'm not sure what, week 2 has to do with the first round of the playoffs, right? At this point, that feels like 7 lifetimes ago. And now I know they've been playing from behind, but the way that Kirk Cousins is playing recently, he has kind of kicked into gear here where all of a sudden he's putting up, some better stats and looking more comfortable in the offense. They figured out the screen game in the last game. They figured out KJ Osborne in the last game. So there's a lot of factors that are kind of going into this for me that even though the bigger numbers say the red flags kind of all over the place here for being a Super Bowl contender, if they roll into the playoffs and fix some of the issues before having had a new coach and had to make big adjustments, they might be a stronger team than they started with.
Yeah, I mean, that's logical. That is analytically backed. That is something that's also in my power rankings, but I was already going on for so long that I was like, and then, I didn't want to go too far there, but there is also something that we adjust, the royal me, adjust based upon how far in the past we're talking about here. Now, what I found is best is there's a discount for every single week going into the future. I'll get into a little bit of the nerd stuff here. It's basically last week's results are worth about 95% of this week's results. If you're saying this week's result, these last week's results were 100%. And then you take that 95%, so 0.095, and you take it to the power of however many weeks you go back. That's how I do it. So if you look 10 weeks ago, I just calculated this out, just give me an idea. The results from 10 weeks ago would only be worth about 60% of the results that we just saw last week. And that's what goes into the calculation. So again, that is part of it. And this is something that I tested and came up with based on the past. Unfortunately, for the Vikings last week, that game against that opponent doesn't look good. Doesn't look good at home. Doesn't look good. It hurts them. That's one of their lower performances, even though they came out with the win. So they're not going to really get credit for that versus a stronger win in the past.
Right. I saw the raging debates over Kirk Cousins' performance because PFF grade, QBR, they did not score it very well. It's like, well, I mean, if you get behind by that much, some bad things had to have happened. And normally every metric is designed to say that when you're down by 30 points, we're not going to give you credit for stuff. And they came back and won. But like, if it's a QBR that's putting in a lot of the expected points added and win probability, you'd be throwing touchdowns and the win probability would be like, no. We're not giving you credit for a touchdown that didn't move the needle at all. So the win probability would only really credit you at the end when you came through. So, and from the grading standpoint, they're going to grade the negative throws that happened along the way. You can't just discount those because you came back. So it's kind of like, it's like this with almost every game for the Vikings that we have to talk about, where, they go to Washington and they're down by 10 in the fourth quarter. They need an interception to come back. Well, the interception happened and a great player made a great play, which is all season long, but also you were down 10 and you needed that to happen in order to come back. And there's just been this sort of back and forth about this team all year long. But I do think that there is something to having a lot of people that have been there before, even Kevin O'Connell with his experience of going and winning the Super Bowl last season, that there has to be something to that. And I've also seen that, older teams tend to win the Super Bowl. A lot of times, and this is an older and more experienced team. So I'm kind of like thinking, matchups are going to play into it, and just how things end up playing out. If somebody else gets upset and you end up with a favorable division round matchup or something, it could be right there for you.
Yeah, it could be. Now let me go back for a second. This gives me a great opportunity to trash PFF. No, I'm just kidding. I do want to talk a little bit about the grading there because, okay, as someone who's been behind the curtain there a little bit as far as the grading process, not responsible for it, but it's basically there's a play-by-play. Maybe this will help edify things for listeners when they're thinking about these grades. So context is not part of the grading system. Throws are like most of the grade, honestly. So again, it's not looking at process, like did he make the right read? It's really looking at throws. And then also, just because of the difficulty of grading every single play and making a nuanced grade on a particular play, most grades are on a play-by-play basis can go from -2, which is like the most ridiculous, worst pass or turnover ever, to a +2, which is again the most ridiculous great play ever, which very rarely happen. 1.5s, they go by 0.5 in either direction, rarely happen. Ones, pretty rare, because even turnover worthy play is a 1 or a big time throw is a 1. That's something that's more in the 4 to like 6% range, basically, even lower on the for some players. And then a lot of plays are just 0.5 in either direction, but most plays are just 0. Most plays they're just giving guys a 0. So these plays that get graded as -1 or +1 have a big effect on grading. And when Kirk Cousins needs to take risks, needs to throw the ball down the field, needs to risk turnover-worthy throws, which can be worth it. Like, it can be worth it to have a couple dropped interceptions if you're going to end up getting more touchdowns in certain circumstances from it. That is going to really negatively affect the grade. So that's probably what drives the grade down quite a lot. Whereas if you look at other measures, and I'm looking at success rate, other things, it wasn't a bad game. Kirk Cousins, if anything, has been pretty good the last couple of weeks versus not being so good and almost like head-scratchingly bad versus what he had been the last several years. So if anything, he's gotten a bit better. Just the defense has really not been great in this sort of matchup, despite the fact that Patrick Peterson, as I mentioned from your Substack, he was, he came in there and just said, we're not going to let him score. Almost, 3 points. Did he get 3 points? But he did a pretty good job not letting him score in the second half.
No, he certainly did. And Jeff Saturday also did a good job not getting them to score in the second half.
I almost feel bad for Jeff Saturday. I'm making the full rotation from being someone who was critical of the hire to being like, what do you want this guy to do anyway? I mean, it is kind of hard. It's a hard situation with this team. It's I don't know. Well, we'll see what happens. Well, I'll save that for the Colts Insider podcast.
Yeah. Part of your explanation also, the Vikings had more yards after catch than any other team in the last 15 years in that game, which would play into it.
That's QBR. So just so you know, so QBR is not going to do that, but QBR has a discount for it's expected points added base, but as a discount for yards after catch versus those in the air, which I think is generally correct, but there are at least certain offenses that are designed to generate yards after catch, most notably the 49ers, where it's kind of unfair to Jimmy Garoppolo to say, like, we're going to take away all of this yards after catch, where, like, literally that's what the offense is designed to do, and he has to make those sorts of plays for it. I think it's somewhat true also of the Vikings. So that's behind the curtain QBR style for what may explain why that's a bit lower for Kirk Cousins.
Well, and when you throw a 64-yard touchdown pass on a screen, like, PFF's not going to give you the big time throw, right?
Right. That's going to be a 0. That's going to be a 0 grade on the play.
Right. So I think that once people understand kind of what it's telling you, it's much easier. It's like, and also anyone who says PFF hates Kirk Cousins, go look at his career grades. I mean, the PFF has graded him extremely well, to the point where I'm like, are you sure? Over the years, but I think
Kirk Cousins' grade being high has been used to discount PFF much more than the reverse.
Right. Which, I mean, it's very easy when you don't look into, which a lot of people don't. I try to explain on the show. If you don't look into how it's done, it's very easy to just be like, I watched that game and I don't agree with that. But you forgot about, there was a throw into the end zone that could have been easily intercepted by the Colts. that was just a really bad choice by Cousins, and it hit the guy in the hands, and no one will ever remember that. But that's their job to grade that. So before we wrap up, Kevin, here's what I want. Give me the best matchup for the Vikings. Give me the nightmare matchup for the Vikings in the first round. Like, they can only play a handful of different teams. Washington, the Giants might still be on the table. Detroit, of course, Seattle. Like, what do you think it would make for a good or bad matchup for them in the first round?
Yeah. Well, okay, that is a good question. I'm trying to think of. Okay, so I'll just go pure. Let me just go through my process here. So if pure power rankings, and again, there's not a huge difference between any of these teams. Pure power rankings wise, I guess it would be the Commanders would be the worst team that I have here of teams who are vying for the playoffs, and their defense actually isn't that bad, but Taylor Heineke is just like not. He's not played well. I guess he has moxie. So maybe if you're scared of moxie, be scared of Taylor Heineke, because the results he's done have just not been good. They went on this preposterous winning streak midseason where he was just awful the entire time, even by PFF grading. A lot of dropped interceptions for him too. So they would probably be the team that I would want to see the most. The Giants are right in there too. I mean, not only do they have maybe a little bit more questions, although I think Daniel Jones has been playing a lot better this year. Injury concerns, not a lot of depth at some key positions. You could probably shut down them offensively a little bit better, even if your defense isn't that great, because of how you could concentrate on Saquon Barkley and not worry as much about the receivers out there. So I think that would probably be next. And I think it's those two really would be the other ones. I would not want to see the Seahawks or the Lions. I think they're just better teams than those two teams. And luckily, at least as of now, the Giants and the Commanders have the advantage over the Seahawks and the Lions. So it would really be those two teams. And the Packers I have is even being better than all those teams, although only slightly better when it comes to the Lions and the Seahawks.
And I think the Packers are playing way better than they were earlier this season, partly because of the emergence of a guy the Vikings gave them in the draft. But that is a discussion for not today. But I think that
Jameson Williams. What if a Jameson Williams scores a touchdown against the Vikings? That would be like red alert. Stage 5. Everyone, Kwesi would have to like run for the bunker if that happened.
Well, yeah, he did score one when they played them in Detroit, but it wasn't like a spectacular play. Yeah, they just didn't cover him at all, which was a problem. But if he scored the game-winning touchdown, it would, the stadium roof did collapse once, but it might collapse again. I think Detroit's the worst matchup because they know the Vikings so well. And you talk about coming to US Bank Stadium. There's a team that's been here a bunch of times. Jared Goff's played pretty well each time they've been here. Like, I think that would be the worst. I'm not as afraid of Seattle because I think that Geno Smith regression, Tyler Lockett injury, that defense can't stop the run, which if you can't stop the Vikings run, they'll play action and everything off of it. So anyway, well, great stuff, Kevin. I feel like we hit like all the big home run analytical topics here surrounding this team. The Unexpected Points newsletter. I've always praised the show name, or it was the podcast, Unexpected Points. I think it's a great name. Now a newsletter.
Podcast still exists. A little bit less frequency, but still exists.
Well, I just signed up yesterday, so I am on your list. Everybody else should go there as well. Unexpected Points. If you have an analytical mind, few people in the world do it as well as Kevin Cole. So thanks so much for your time, man. And we will definitely do it again.
All right. Thanks for having me.